By the end of the previous story, something unusual had happened. Authority had stopped needing to shout. Rules no longer required constant enforcement. Punishments no longer needed to be visible every day. Most people followed the system without being told, not because they were forced, not even because they were afraid, but because the structure had become familiar. Familiar things rarely feel like control. They feel like normal life. A bell rings. You gather, the market opens, you trade. The ritual begins, you participate. Each action feels small, reasonable. No one pauses to ask where the pattern came from, because patterns that repeat long enough stop feeling like choices. They become background, like the rhythm of breathing. And yet something else was quietly changing beneath the surface. Belief was fading. The original reasons for many rules were slowly disappearing. Explanations that once felt convincing began to sound distant. Some customs continued even after the problems they solved had vanished. But the behavior remained. People still followed the rituals. They still repeated the instructions. They still moved through the same routines, not because they believed deeply, but because stopping would have required thinking again, and thinking after generations of habit had become unfamiliar work. So obedience entered a new phase, a quieter phase, one where rules no longer needed belief to survive, and instead they relied on something much stronger: ritual, repetition, and the quiet fear of doing things the wrong way. Tonight, we are going to explore that second stage, the moment when rituals began to replace thinking, when correctness became more important than understanding, and when people continued to obey systems they no longer fully believed in, because obedience does not disappear when belief fades. Sometimes that is when it becomes most stable, and the story of how that happened begins with something that seems harmless: ritual. Rituals that replaced thinking. Rituals did not begin as control, they began as shortcuts. In a world where energy was scarce and days were long, rituals reduced effort. They told people what came next without requiring reflection. You did not have to decide how to begin the day. The bell rang. You did not have to decide when to stop working. The light faded and the custom followed. You did not have to ask what behavior was appropriate. The ritual answered for you. Ritual saved thought. And saving thought felt merciful. Medieval life demanded constant physical labor. Mental labor was not treated as a resource to cultivate. It was treated as something to conserve. Thinking was tiring. Reconsidering was risky. Questioning was disruptive. Rituals smoothed the edges of existence. They transformed uncertainty into sequence. Sequence feels safe. Morning followed night. Work followed prayer. Feast followed fast. Silence followed bells. Life gained a pattern. Patterns calm the nervous system. You move through them without friction. Over time, the pattern becomes more important than the purpose. People stop asking why a ritual exists. They ask only whether it is being performed correctly. Correctness replaces understanding. This shift is quiet. No one announces it. It happens when repetition becomes automatic. At first, a ritual requires attention. Later, it requires memory. Eventually, it requires neither. The body performs it before the mind notices. This is the moment thinking steps aside. Rituals excel at this. They embed instruction into movement. Kneel, stand, speak, wait. The action carries the rule. No explanation is necessary. An explanation, once removed, is rarely missed. Medieval Europe filled itself with rituals. Daily rituals, seasonal rituals, religious rituals, social rituals. Each one small, each one familiar, each one asking less of the mind than the day before. Rituals answered questions in advance. What matters? What is allowed? What is forbidden? You did not need to debate. The ritual already decided. This decision-making by inheritance felt natural. People did not experience it as loss. They experienced it as continuity. Continuity is comforting. Continuity suggests stability. In an unstable world, stability feels sacred. So rituals expanded. They filled gaps. Moments that once required judgment became moments of performance. How to greet, how to mourn, how to celebrate, how to obey. Every transition received a script. Scripts reduce anxiety. When you know your lines, you do not fear the stage. Rituals also distribute responsibility. If something goes wrong, it is not because you chose poorly. You followed the ritual. That matters. It protects the self. Over time, this protection becomes dependence. People grow uncomfortable without ritual. Unstructured time feels empty. Silence feels heavy. Choice feels dangerous. Rituals provide reassurance that nothing unexpected will be required. They narrow the range of acceptable behavior. Narrowing feels like clarity. Clarity feels kind. So rituals become the preferred state. They spread because they are easy to adopt. You do not need to understand them. You only need to copy. Copying requires no authority. It spreads sideways. Neighbor to neighbor, parent to child, apprentice to master. Soon, no one remembers a time without the ritual. At that point, it no longer feels optional. Questioning a ritual feels rude. It interrupts flow. It suggests distrust. And distrust is uncomfortable. So, rituals discourage thought without forbidding it. They make thinking unnecessary. Unnecessary things are rarely practiced. This is how rituals replace thinking, not through suppression, but through redundancy. Why think when the answer arrives automatically? Why consider alternatives when the path is already marked? Why imagine change when repetition feels safe? Rituals also create belonging. To perform the ritual correctly is to signal membership. To hesitate is to reveal uncertainty. Uncertainty attracts attention. Attention invites correction, so people perform confidently, even when they do not understand. Confidence matters more than comprehension. Ritual rewards fluency, not insight. This shapes identity. People begin to see themselves not as decision makers, but as participants. Participation feels communal. Thinking feels solitary. Solitude is suspicious. Communal rhythm is celebrated. Rituals synchronize behavior. Synchronization creates harmony. Harmony feels moral. Deviation feels wrong. Even when harmless, this moralization of ritual is one of its quiet powers. The act itself becomes good, not because of outcome, but because of tradition. Tradition accumulates authority over time. No single ritual holds much weight, but together they form a cage. That does not feel like one, it feels like structure. Structure feels responsible. Responsible feels virtuous. So rituals are defended, not aggressively, gently, with phrases like, "This is how it's done. This has always worked. There's a reason." Often, no one remembers the reason. The phrase replaces it. Language becomes ritual too. Stock responses, expected tones, approved words. Speech follows pattern. Silence follows pattern. Even disagreement follows pattern, as long as it remains within ritual boundaries. This is crucial. Rituals do not eliminate dissent. They choreograph it. They allow controlled expressions that do not threaten the system. This gives the illusion of freedom, and people feel heard without being disruptive. The ritual absorbs the energy of critique and returns it harmlessly. Over time, people stop trying to think outside ritual, not because they are forbidden, but because they are unused. Thinking requires practice. Ritual removes the need to practice. Like an unused muscle, independent judgment weakens. People rely on signals, on timing, on cues. They wait to be told what moment it is, what feeling is appropriate, what reaction is expected. Rituals become internal clocks. They regulate emotion as much as behavior. When to feel grief, when to feel joy, when to feel fear. Emotions are scheduled. This scheduling feels orderly. Order feels safe. So people surrender emotional spontaneity. They trade it for predictability. And predictability is addictive because it reduces surprise. Surprise demands thinking, thinking demands effort. Rituals spare effort. This is their appeal, but there is a cost. When rituals replace thinking, adaptation slows. New situations are met with old responses. Responses that once worked are repeated without evaluation. This does not immediately cause failure. It causes stagnation. Stagnation feels peaceful until change arrives, and change always arrives. But by then, the habit of thinking has weakened. People wait for ritual to respond. When it doesn't, they feel lost. This is when authority reappears, not with force, but with new rituals, new sequences, new habits. Again, thinking is bypassed. Again, relief is felt. This cycle continues. Rituals replace thinking. Not because people are incapable, but because systems reward ease. Ease spreads, difficulty retreats. Thinking is difficult. Ritual is easy. So ritual wins, and once ritual wins, authority no longer needs to explain itself. It only needs to maintain rhythm. As long as the rhythm holds, the system feels alive. And when rhythm breaks, people panic. Not because they know what is wrong, but because the familiar sequence is gone. This panic is not intellectual. It is physical. The body expects cues. Without them, it tenses. Rituals train bodies before they train minds. That is why they endure. Long after belief fades, long after purpose dissolves, the ritual remains. Performed, repeated, unquestioned. Not because anyone demands it, but because stopping would require thinking again. And thinking, after a long enough time, feels like too much to ask. The fear of doing it wrong. At first, rituals guide behavior. Later, they shape emotion. And eventually, they produce fear. Not fear of punishment, not fear of authority, but fear of error. This fear does not arrive loudly. It settles quietly, like a weight placed gently on the chest, until breathing adjusts around it. In medieval Europe, people rarely asked, "What happens if I disobey?" They asked something far subtler. "What if I do this wrong?" Wrong did not mean illegal. Wrong meant improper, unfitting, out of rhythm. Wrong meant visible, and visibility was dangerous. Rituals taught people how to move without attracting attention, and they showed how to blend. But once blending becomes habit, standing out begins to feel unnatural, suspicious. The fear was not always conscious. It lived in hesitation, in pauses before speaking, in glances toward others before acting. People learned to read the room. Before making decisions, they waited for cues, they looked for confirmation. This was not cowardice. It was adaptation. Medieval life depended on reputation. Reputation was fragile. A single misstep could echo longer than a mistake itself. So people became careful. Not bold. Careful is quiet. Quiet survives. The fear of doing it wrong did not come from rules alone. It came from watching others, from observing reactions, from seeing how small deviations were met. A neighbor corrected gently. A friend laughed awkwardly. An elder frowned. No punishment required. The message arrived anyway. You have stepped outside the pattern. Most people stepped back quickly. Correction did not need to be harsh. It only needed to be public. Public discomfort is memorable. So people learned in advance. They anticipated judgment. They imagined reactions. They adjusted before acting. This anticipation is powerful. It turns society into a mirror that reflects expectations constantly. And people internalize what they see. Over time, The fear shifted. It was no longer about external reaction. It became internal tension, a tightening in the chest. Before deviation, a sense of unease. When improvising, people began to doubt themselves, not their intentions, their instincts. Instinct became unreliable. Custom became safer. This is when thinking becomes risky, because thinking opens alternatives. Alternatives invite choice. Choice invites error. Error invites judgment. So people learned to limit their thoughts. They did not imagine other ways. They imagined consequences, not physical consequences. Social ones, shame, embarrassment, loss of standing. These were harder to recover from than fines or scolding. Punishment ends, reputation lingers, so people chose safety. Safety meant correctness. Correctness meant conformity. And conformity required vigilance. The fear of doing it wrong turned daily life into quiet self-surveillance. People checked themselves, their words, their gestures, their timing. They asked silently, "Is this appropriate?" Not once, constantly. This constant checking was exhausting, but it felt necessary because the cost of error was social friction. Friction slowed life. And medieval life already moved slowly enough, and so people smoothed themselves. They rounded their edges. They avoided extremes. Better to be unremarkable than memorable for the wrong reason. This fear spread easily. Parents taught it to children, not through lectures, but through correction. Don't do that. That's not how it's done. People will notice. Children learned quickly. They learned before they could reason. Fear arrived early. It did not feel like fear, it felt like awareness. Awareness of being watched, even when no one was watching. This awareness did not fade with age. It deepened. Adults learned that certainty was rewarded. Confidence in ritual. Fluency in custom. Hesitation marked you as inexperienced, or worse, disruptive. So people practiced correctness. They rehearsed behavior. They memorized responses. They avoided novelty. Novelty carried risk. Even kindness could be risky if performed incorrectly. So generosity followed rules. Hospitality had limits. Everything had a shape. And shape mattered more than intention. This is how morality subtly changes. It becomes procedural. Doing good is less important than doing good correctly. The fear of doing it wrong reshapes values. People stop asking, "Is this right?" They ask, "Is this acceptable?" Acceptability is social. It depends on context. So people remain alert. They watch others. They adjust. They adapt. Life becomes a performance without a stage. Always on, always visible. Even in solitude, the internal audience remains. People imagine how actions would appear. If seen, this imagined gaze is one of authority's greatest achievements. It removes the need for presence, no guard required, no judge needed. The mind supplies them. Over time, fear narrows possibility. People choose the familiar path, not because it is better, but because it is known. Known paths feel safe. Unknown paths feel exposed. Exposure invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites correction. Correction invites shame. So people stay inside boundaries that grow increasingly tight. Not because anyone tightened them deliberately, but because fear encourages caution. Caution accumulates. Each generation inherits it. They are born into a world already shaped by restraint. They assume this is natural. They do not question why certain things feel uncomfortable. They simply avoid them. This avoidance feels sensible. It does not feel imposed. That is what makes it effective. The fear of doing it wrong rarely produces rebellion. It produces silence. Silence is easier to manage. Silence does not challenge. Silence does not demand explanation. So societies that cultivate fear of error become quiet, not peaceful. Careful. Carefulness looks like order. Order looks like success. So the system is praised. People point to stability as evidence of wisdom. They forget the cost. The cost is creativity, spontaneity, experiment. But those losses are subtle. They do not announce themselves. They fade. People stop imagining alternatives. Without noticing, they stop trusting themselves. They defer. Deference feels respectful. Respect is valued. So fear disguises itself as virtue. A person who does not question is seen as mature. A person who hesitates is seen as thoughtful. A person who conforms is seen as reliable. These traits are rewarded, and reward reinforces fear, because stepping outside the expected now risks losing not just comfort, but identity. Who are you if you do not follow the pattern? This question is frightening. So people cling to correctness. They follow rituals precisely. They speak carefully. They act predictably. Predictability becomes a form of safety. The fear of doing it wrong does not scream, it whispers, it suggests, it nudges. And because it never demands, it is rarely resisted. By the time people notice it, it feels like part of themselves. They say, I'm just careful. I prefer structure. I don't like causing trouble. They do not say, I am afraid. But the fear is there. Quiet, persistent, guiding behavior. Authority no longer needs to command. It waits. Fear does the work. And as long as people fear doing it wrong, they will continue doing what feels right, even when they no longer remember. Who decided what right meant? Obedience without belief. At first, obedience is rooted in belief. People follow rules because they trust the reason behind them. They accept authority because it promises protection, order, or meaning. But belief is fragile. It requires renewal. It requires explanation. It requires a world that still resembles the one that created it. Over time, medieval Europe changed, slowly, unevenly, almost imperceptibly. Conditions shifted, threats evolved, needs transformed, but the rules remained. And belief began to thin. People noticed the gaps. The rule no longer solved the problem it once addressed. The ritual no longer matched the moment. The explanation no longer satisfied. But obedience did not vanish. It simply detached. This is a critical moment because obedience without belief is not driven by conviction. It is driven by habit. Habit does not ask why. Habit repeats. People continued to follow instructions they no longer fully understood, not because they agreed, but because disagreement required effort. Effort invited attention. Attention invited friction, and friction had become something to avoid. Belief fades quietly. There is rarely a single moment when people stop believing. It happens in fragments. A rule feels unnecessary one day. A ritual feels empty the next. An instruction feels arbitrary. But people comply anyway, because compliance is easier than confrontation. Because routines still work, even when meaning is gone. This obedience is different. It is hollow. It lacks enthusiasm, it lacks conviction, but it is reliable. Authority prefers reliable behavior over sincere belief. Belief is unpredictable. It can turn into doubt. It can turn into zeal. Habit is stable. Habit produces consistency. So systems tolerate disbelief. As long as obedience remains intact, medieval Europe drifted into this state gradually. People stopped asking whether rules were just. They asked whether rules were required. Required by whom? Required for what? Those questions often went unanswered. But the behavior continued. Markets opened on schedule. Rituals were performed. Customs observed. Life moved forward. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. Order persisted, but something had changed internally. People followed instructions without internal agreement. They complied mechanically. This mechanical obedience feels neutral. It does not burn with devotion, and it does not resist. It simply moves. This kind of obedience is difficult to challenge because it appears calm. There is no outrage, no protest, just continuation. People who obey without belief rarely feel oppressed. They feel detached. They do not identify deeply with the rules, but they do not oppose them either. Opposition requires belief of another kind. Belief that change is possible. Belief that action matters. Those beliefs are heavier than compliance. So people choose lightness. They move through the motions. They perform rituals without emotional investment, and they follow procedures without internal alignment. They say the words without feeling them. This does not feel dramatic, and it feels practical. Practicality becomes the justification. This is how things are done. There's no point arguing. It's easier this way. Easier than what? Easier than explaining, easier than challenging, easier than standing alone. Belief creates friction. It demands expression. Disbelief creates tension. It demands courage. Habit avoids both. So habit wins. Authority learns to accept this arrangement. It no longer needs loyalty. It needs predictability. A person who obeys reluctantly still obeys, a person who obeys out of habit is often more dependable than one who obeys passionately. Passion fluctuates. Habit persists. This is how obedience survives belief. By becoming automatic, people begin to separate inner thought from outer action. They think privately, they act publicly. This division feels safe. Thought is invisible. Action is not. So thought retreats inward. Action remains aligned with expectation. This split becomes normal. People learn to say one thing and feel another, not dishonestly, cautiously. They understand that belief is personal. Obedience is communal. Communal life requires coordination. Coordination requires consistency. Consistency requires compliance. Belief is optional. Over time, belief becomes irrelevant. No one asks what people believe. They ask whether behavior conforms. The question shifts from conviction to performance. Are you doing what is expected? If yes, nothing else matters. This creates a strange calm. Conflict disappears. Debate quiets. Because belief no longer enters the public space, people stop persuading. They stop arguing. They stop caring whether others agree. Agreement is unnecessary if obedience remains. This calm is deceptive. It feels like peace, but it is closer to inertia. Systems running on obedience without belief do not adapt well. They continue out of momentum. They resist change, not because people oppose it, but because no one feels invested enough to initiate it. Disbelief does not motivate action. It drains it. People comply while feeling disconnected. This disconnection dulls urgency. Nothing feels worth fighting over, so nothing changes. Authority does not need to silence belief. It waits for belief to exhaust itself. Without reinforcement, belief fades. Ritual continues. Routine continues. Obedience continues. And belief becomes a private inconvenience. People learn to live with contradiction. They follow rules they privately question. They perform rituals they no longer feel. They teach customs they do not fully understand. Not cynically, pragmatically. Life demands cooperation. Belief is secondary. Children grow up inside this environment. They learn obedience before belief. They learn how to behave long before they are taught why. By the time belief is introduced, obedience is already natural. Belief feels optional. Behavior feels necessary. This inversion is subtle, but it matters. A society that obeys without belief is stable but brittle. It holds shape. Without internal cohesion, it appears unified. Without shared conviction from the outside, it looks strong. From the inside, it feels empty. People move through life. Without asking what they are moving toward, they focus on correctness. Correctness replaces purpose. As long as actions are correct, meaning is irrelevant. This allows systems to persist long after they stop making sense. No one believes strongly enough to defend them. No one cares enough to dismantle them. so they remain. Obedience without belief is not loyal, it is patient, it waits. Not for change, for continuation. This is why authority values it. It is quiet. It is predictable. It does not resist. It does not require persuasion. It does not demand explanation. It simply repeats. And repetition is enough to keep a structure standing. Even when its foundation has eroded, even when its purpose is forgotten, even when belief has moved on. People often assume that disbelief leads to rebellion, but more often it leads to compliance without care. And compliance without care is one of the most enduring forces in history. Because it does not burn, it does not shout, it does not collapse suddenly, it just continues. And as long as it continues, authority does not need belief. It only needs habit. And habit, once established, is difficult to interrupt, not because people believe in it, but because stopping would require effort. And effort after a long enough time feels like too much to ask. When disobedience felt immature. There comes a point when disobedience stops looking threatening, not because authority has grown kinder, but because resistance has been reclassified. In medieval Europe, this shift was quiet. Disobedience was no longer framed as rebellion. It was framed as immaturity, a lack of understanding, a failure to grow up. And this change mattered more than punishment ever had. When resistance is dangerous, it can be heroic. When resistance is childish, it becomes embarrassing. Authority understood this instinctively. It learned that the easiest way to neutralize opposition was not to crush it, but to belittle it. People who questioned customs were not attacked, they were corrected. Gently, patiently, with a tone reserved for children who had not yet learned how the world worked. You'll understand when you're older. That's not how things are done. This isn't the time. These phrases carried no threat. They carried dismissal. Dismissal is powerful. It removes urgency. It reframes disagreement as a phase rather than a position, and phases pass. Medieval communities prized composure. To be calm was to be wise. To be measured was to be respected. Anger looked unstable. Passion looked uncontrolled. Those who challenged norms often did so emotionally. They spoke urgently. They demanded explanation. Urgency itself became suspect. Calm authority contrasted itself against emotional resistance. Authority waited, resistance rushed. Waiting looks mature, rushing looks young. So the narrative shifted. Those who complied were sensible. Those who questioned were impulsive. This framing did not require censorship. It required patience. Authority did not argue back. It listened politely, then continued unchanged. Nothing deflates resistance, like being ignored calmly. Over time, people learned the lesson. Questioning did not lead to debate. It led to quiet smiles, to indulgent nods, to the subtle sense that one had misunderstood something obvious. No one wants to feel foolish. So people stopped asking. They learned to keep doubts private. Public disagreement risked social diminishment, not punishment, diminishment. To be seen as naive, idealistic, unseasoned. These labels carry weight. They suggest a lack of experience, a lack of seriousness. Serious people do not challenge foundational systems. They work within them. That was the message. So resistance aged poorly. It did not look brave. It looked impatient, like someone trying to skip steps. Authority aligned itself with adulthood. It presented itself as measured, slow, experienced. Resistance was framed as youthful energy that would eventually settle. This framing allowed authority to avoid confrontation indefinitely. Why argue with something that will grow out of itself? Why respond when time will handle it? This approach worked because time does soften urgency. People age, responsibilities accumulate, energy disperses. Doubts remain, but they become quieter. People learn the cost of standing out. They learn that conformity offers stability. Stability feels adult. Chaos feels juvenile. So people adjusted their behavior to match the adult tone. They moderated speech. They avoided extremes. They adopted the language of reasonableness. And reasonableness meant compliance. In this environment, obedience became a marker of maturity. A mature person understands that systems are imperfect, but necessary. A mature person does not demand change, they manage expectations. This idea spread. It became common sense. Children were taught early that questioning rules was acceptable, briefly, but persistence was discouraged. Enough questions. You're old enough to know better. Don't make a fuss. Curiosity was tolerated. Insistence was not. This distinction mattered. It taught people that inquiry had limits. Beyond those limits, you were no longer thoughtful. You were difficult. Difficult people are exhausting. Adults do not want to be exhausting. So they learned restraint. They learned timing. They learned silence. Disobedience did not disappear. It was postponed. People told themselves they would challenge things later, when they had more standing and more experience, more authority. Later rarely arrived, because later came with more to lose. Disobedience felt riskier with age. A child can afford embarrassment. An adult cannot. So resistance faded with responsibility. Authority did not need to suppress dissent. It waited for adulthood to do it. This was efficient and subtle. People believed they had chosen compliance. They believed they had matured. They did not see that maturity had been defined for them, defined as acceptance, defined as patience, defined as quiet endurance. In this definition, change was childish, idealism was naive, desire for reform was unserious. Serious people managed reality. They did not challenge it. This belief shaped generations. Young people learned quickly which behaviors earned respect: calm agreement, measured obedience, low expectations. High expectations were framed as youthful excess. Excess burns out. Authority waited for that burnout. And usually it came, because resistance requires energy, and energy diminishes under pressure. Work, family, and obligation. Life teaches compromise. Compromise feels mature, so people compromised with systems they once questioned. They did not abandon doubt. They simply stopped acting on it. Action felt irresponsible. Responsibility meant stability. Stability meant predictability. Predictability meant safety. So disobedience retreated inward. It became thought without action, opinion without consequence. This suited authority perfectly. People could think whatever they wanted, as long as behavior remained consistent. And behavior did remain consistent because disobedience had been reframed. It was no longer brave. It was childish. Childish things are forgiven but not followed. No one builds a life around what they did as a child. So resistance lost its future. It became something you outgrow, something you look back on with embarrassment. I was young. I didn't understand how things worked. These phrases became confessions. People distanced themselves from their earlier doubts. They rewrote their own history, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. Authority did not need to rewrite history. People did it themselves. This is one of the quietest victories of power. When people reinterpret their own resistance as immaturity, when they police their own memories, when they teach the next generation to grow out of questioning. Thus, obedience gained a new justification. Not fear, not belief, maturity. And maturity is difficult to argue against because no one wants to be seen as perpetually young. So people complied, they nodded, they accepted, they learned to wait. For what? They were no longer sure. But waiting felt responsible. Waiting felt adult. And in that waiting, systems continued. Not because they were loved, not because they were believed, but because resisting them no longer felt grown up. The quiet loop that never broke. Power does not always arrive with conquest. Sometimes it arrives with instruction, and sometimes it arrives already settled, already accepted, already passed down. In medieval Europe, control rarely needed to announce itself to the next generation. It was inherited, not through laws alone, not through force, but through upbringing. Children did not learn authority as an external pressure. They learned it as atmosphere. They absorbed it the way they absorbed language, tone, gesture, by watching, by copying, by being corrected gently. No one told them, this is power. They were told, this is how things are done. And that distinction matters. An inherited system does not feel imposed. It feels natural. Children grow up inside routines that predate them. They do not question origins. They assume continuity. Why would they? The world has always been this way. By the time a child is old enough to ask why, the answer feels obvious. Because this is how it works. That answer satisfies more often than it should. Authority understood this deeply. It did not need to persuade each generation anew. It needed only to ensure smooth transmission. Transmission is quiet. It happens in kitchens, in workshops, in churches, in fields, It happens when a parent corrects posture, when a master corrects timing, when an elder corrects tone. These corrections feel personal and they feel caring. They do not feel political. So control becomes intimate. It lives in advice, in warnings, in expectations. People inherit not only property, but patterns. They inherit habits of obedience, habits of caution, habits of restraint. No ceremony is required. The inheritance arrives through repetition. Children learn what is acceptable long before they understand what is possible. Possibility remains abstract. Acceptability is immediate, and acceptability guides behavior, so the next generation does not need to be controlled. They arrive already shaped, already aligned, already cautious, already fluent in the unspoken rules. Authority does not need to be taught explicitly. It is demonstrated daily in what is praised, in what is discouraged, in what is ignored. Ignoring is especially powerful. Children learn quickly which questions receive attention and which drift into silence. Silence is instructive. It tells you what not to pursue. So curiosity narrows, not because it is forbidden, but because it is unrewarded. This is how control reproduces itself, without effort, without supervision, without visible enforcement. By the time a person reaches adulthood, most boundaries feel self-evident. They do not feel like boundaries, they feel like common sense. Common sense is inherited. It is rarely examined. People defend it instinctively, even when they cannot explain it. This defense feels personal. To question common sense is to question upbringing. And questioning upbringing feels ungrateful, so people protect the system that raised them, not because it is perfect, but because it is familiar. Familiarity breeds loyalty. Quiet loyalty, the kind that does not speak loudly, but endures. Authority becomes invisible at this stage. There is no ruler shouting commands, no force displayed. Only patterns repeating. Children grow into adults who enforce the same expectations they once resisted quietly. They correct others the way they were corrected. They pass on caution as wisdom, yet they call it experience. This reframing matters. Control is no longer seen as restriction. It is seen as guidance. Guidance offered by those who have lived longer. That guidance feels earned. It feels generous. So it is accepted. The inheritance is complete. When people believe they are choosing freely, within limits they did not choose, this belief is comfortable. It allows people to feel autonomous, without challenging structure. They make decisions, but only among acceptable options. The unacceptable options never enter the mind, not because they are forbidden, but because they are unimaginable. This is the most efficient form of control, when possibility is narrowed before choice begins. Medieval Europe perfected this quietly. Generations passed without needing constant reinforcement. Authority rested, not dormant, embedded. It waited in habits, in customs, in the instinct to say, "That's just how it is." That phrase carried centuries of instruction. No one needed to remember the original reasons. The pattern was enough. Over time, people stopped noticing control at all. They noticed disruption instead. Anything that disturbed rhythm felt wrong, not immoral, unsettling. So stability became the goal, not justice, not improvement. Stability meant continuity. Continuity meant safety. Safety justified everything. People protected the familiar, even when it no longer served them, because unfamiliarity felt dangerous. Thus, control inherited itself, not through fear, not through belief, through comfort. Comfort with routine, comfort with predictability, comfort with knowing one's place. This comfort dulled urgency. Change felt unnecessary. Unnecessary. Things are postponed. Postponement becomes permanence, and permanence becomes tradition. Tradition does not argue. It waits. It survives storms. It absorbs criticism. It outlives belief because it is not held up by conviction. It is held up by repetition. Parents pass it to children without naming it. Teachers reinforce it without intending to. Communities maintain it without planning to. No single person is responsible. That is why it is difficult to undo. There is no villain to confront, no moment to reverse, only a slow accumulation of inherited expectations. People look back and see no obvious beginning, so they assume it must be natural. But it was built quietly, patiently, by people who never intended to create a system of control. They only wanted stability, relief, order, and in solving their immediate problems, they passed on a solution that no longer knew how to stop. This is the quiet inheritance of control, not imposed, not enforced, inherited. And inheritance is powerful because you do not feel owned by what you believe belongs to you. You protect it, you preserve it, you pass it on, and in doing so, you ensure that control continues without ever needing to reveal itself. It rests, waiting, comfortable, already prepared for the next generation to receive it without asking where it came from. Letting the pattern rest. Nothing dramatic happens at the end. There is no collapse, no revelation, no moment when everyone suddenly understands. History rarely ends that way. More often it slows. The patterns we have followed tonight do not disappear when the story pauses. They simply continue without asking for attention. Medieval Europe did not wake up one morning and decide to live inside invisible boundaries. It drifted there, step by step, habit by habit, correction by correction. No single rule caused it. No single authority demanded it. It accumulated quietly in the background of daily life. People woke, worked, spoke carefully, moved predictably. They followed rhythms that once brought comfort, and comfort does not announce when it becomes constraint. It feels the same. That is what makes it durable. By the time anyone might have noticed, there was nothing obvious to point to. No chains, no guards, no shouting orders, only routines, only expectations, only the sense that doing otherwise would require effort. That did not seem necessary. So people rested inside the pattern. They rested because rest was scarce. They rested because thinking was heavy. They rested because deciding felt like something better postponed. And postponement became normal. Generations passed. Children learned without being taught. They learned what was appropriate by watching reactions. They learned where to stand by noticing where others stood. They learned when to speak by hearing when silence fell. No one needed to explain. Explanation would have required remembering why things were this way. Memory is fragile. Repetition is not. So repetition carried the structure forward, quietly, patiently. The bells rang, the rituals continued, the rules stayed in place. Not because anyone believed deeply, not because anyone resisted fiercely, but because everything still functioned well enough. And well enough is powerful. Well enough discourages change. It suggests that effort would exceed reward. It suggests that disruption is unnecessary. It suggests waiting. Waiting becomes a habit. Waiting feels mature. Waiting feels responsible. Waiting feels safe. So people waited. They waited inside systems that no longer asked for belief, and they waited inside customs that no longer explained themselves. They waited while authority rested, confident that it no longer needed to act. This is not a story of villains. No one intended this outcome. Each decision made sense in its moment. Each rule solved a real problem. Each ritual reduced uncertainty. Each habit saved time. The problem was not intention. It was accumulation, small comforts layered, until movement felt unnatural, stability thickened, until curiosity slowed. Life became navigable, but narrow, predictable, but heavy. And still, people lived. They laughed. They loved. They endured. History continued quietly, which is why this story does not end with a warning. Warnings are loud. They wake people up. This story prefers to soften, to let the mind drift, to let the patterns settle without demanding judgment. Because even noticing them takes effort. And effort is scarce at night. So instead, we allow the noise to fade. The bells ring less sharply. The rituals loosen their grip. The fear of doing it wrong softens into stillness. Not gone, just resting. The inheritance continues, without hurry, without urgency, without resistance. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought. Not that control is cruel, but that it is comfortable. Not that obedience is forced, but that it is learned gently. Not that systems endure through violence, but that they endure through rest. So tonight, There is nothing to fix, nothing to undo, nothing to confront, only patterns that once helped people survive and then stayed. You do not need to judge them. Judgment sharpens the mind. Sharpness wakes the body. This story is not here to wake you. It is here to sit quietly beside you. While history breathes slowly, let the rhythm carry itself. Let the structure remain just visible enough to feel its weight and then fade. There will be time for thinking later. For now, there is rest. And in rest, the patterns do what they have always done. They continue, softly, without asking. And you, like so many before you, are free to simply notice and let the night pass without deciding what any of it means.